Good evening. In Chapter 1, we talked about the human population explosion. We noted that if we don't somehow learn to control the rate at which human beings are increasing and or find a way to extend or get more resources from the earth upon which we live, that human beings may someday well become extinct. In the last chapter, and the chapter before that, we looked in particular at the issue of human population growth and some of the factors that contribute to that particular problem, and some of the ways that we might be able to address that problem. In chapter 12, we're going to look at the issue of extending the resources that the world already has for us, how we can produce more goods and in particular more food to feed the population that we already have on Earth and that we may continue to support into the future. As you may recall, it was during the Neolithic Revolution that man first learned how to grow his own food. And by doing so, he was no longer at the mercy of following animals or following seasons in order to have food to eat. He could grow his own crops, store them during bad weather, and in so doing be able to stay in one place, which was a major step towards the civilization of humankind. But for many thousands of years, growing food was done in a very labor intensive way, as you see in the one picture that we have down here. Man, through his own efforts and through that of perhaps animals, was able to grow limited amounts of food for himself and a little more perhaps to trade with others in order to keep himself alive. But in the last few hundred years, dramatic changes in the way in which we grow food has made a big difference in our ability to produce food not only for ourselves, but for all the world. Improvements in such processes as irrigation so that more land can become productive in terms of growing food. The use of technology such as occurred with the Industrial Revolution that allowed man to develop machinery that would allow him to grow and harvest food from much larger tracts of land than he was ever able to do before. And the development of herbicides and pesticides that allowed him to grow food of more and more density, if you will, on his land without having to lose some of his crops to disease and pests. All of these improvements in technology and ability to grow food have allowed man to, especially in places like the United States, produce more food on less land than ever before, and in so doing accomplish one of the things that he needs to do to sustain life, that is, produce more food than he has in the past to sustain the ever larger population of human beings on the planet. However, one of the most important developments in farming occurred within the last 50 years and was termed the Green Revolution. It began with an effort back in the 1940s to deal with the starvation that was occurring in Mexico as a result of extended droughts and bad weather that decimated the wheat crop in Mexico. So the United States, as part of an international effort, sent scientists to Mexico to see what they could do to help address the problem. The solution they came up with was to take a native variety of wheat from Mexico and crossbreed or hybridize it with a high yield type of wheat that was grown in the Midwest of the United States. The resulting crop was a type of wheat that was able to survive the drought of Mexico and the high winds of Mexico, yet at the same time produce a very high yield amount of wheat. This new type of hybrid plant then was able to sustain and feed the population of Mexico and stave off a very real issue of famine. The effort was so successful that it was also exported to other countries, most notably India, and in a relatively short time, this technology was being used to feed many millions of people that otherwise might have died due to lack of food and starvation. This new approach to dealing with improving the ability of land to grow food was called the Green Revolution, and is still being used today to improve different varieties of crops so that they're more resistant to pests, more resistant to adverse environmental conditions, and able to produce better, stronger, healthier, more tasty food. More recently, the advent of biotechnology has allowed scientists to move beyond the green revolution to what is now being called the gene revolution. The major limitation in the green revolution is that you could only hybridize within the same species. That is, you had to have two different varieties of wheat that could pollinate each other in order to create a new strain of wheat with the desired characteristics. So you were limited to finding, if you will, different varieties within the same gene pool with which to work to find the characteristics you wanted. With biotechnology, we are now able to actually extract from the DNA of one species of plant or animal and inject the characteristics that we want via its DNA into a totally different variety of or species of plant or animal. For instance, we see here the evolution of a particularly interesting type of rice. As you're probably aware, the main food of many Asian peoples is rice. The typical rice is shown down here in this white variety of rice that we're familiar with. However, for the people who eat almost an exclusive diet of white rice, these people are lacking in many important vitamins necessary for good health. So, in order to address this problem, some scientists attempted to transplant the gene for beta carotene, an important vitamin, into the genome or DNA of white rice to see whether or not they could create a variety of rice that contained this important vitamin in it, and so provide to the Asian peoples a food source that had an important dietary supplement already in it. And they were successful in doing this. Interestingly enough, however, the source of the beta carotene gene that they used was from carrots. Carrots, as you probably know, are a source of good vitamins. Your mom may have told you to eat carrots so that you would have good eyesight. Well, this is specifically the vitamin that was used for this purpose and whose gene was transplanted into white rice. Interestingly enough, though, the technology for transplanting the gene wasn't precise enough to select only just that one gene. It carried with it some additional genes, one of which coded for the orange color of the carrot itself. And when this orange color was transplanted into the white rice, it gave this rather golden hued type of rice, signifying that this variety of rice in fact contained the gene for beta carotene. And this rice, because of its color, was known thereafter as golden rice. They continued to refine this technology until now golden rice actually has this much deeper gold color to signify the higher intensity of the gene product, beta carotene, that is being produced by the rice. In this way, scientists have been able to not only improve the amount of food that is being produced, but improve the quality and the health benefits of the food that is being produced via biotechnology. As a result of all these new technologies in the last 100 years, man has been able to not only keep up with the food requirements of the human population, but actually exceed them. As you see from this graph, over the last 75 years as shown here, the amount of meat production has increased 2.5-fold, or 250% if you will, and the amount of grain production has increased by, again, at least 50%, while the human population itself has only increased by about 50%. So right now, there is more than enough food being produced on the planet to feed all of the people that currently live on the planet. So then, why are people starving? Now, the problem is not that we don't have enough food. The problem is that the food isn't getting where it's needed. That issue is best illustrated by the graph on this slide. As you'll note, back in 1935, all of these various areas of the world, with the exception of Western Europe, were producing enough food by virtue of the positive values to feed themselves and export food to other parts of the world. Only Europe was importing food in order to support its population. Some 70 years later, we see that the opposite has occurred. In fact, during that time, all of the other populations that were uh, producing sufficient food to feed themselves are now importing food, whereas Europe was able to um, reverse their decline and now is producing just enough food to support the population they have. This is primarily due to the fact of the changes in the relative populations of these areas. Africa, Asia, and to a lesser extent Latin America have all had significant population growths that outstripped the ability of those countries to continue to produce enough food. Whereas Western Europe has had just the opposite happen. Western Europe, as you recall, not only has slowed their population growth, but they've actually reversed it and they're having a negative population growth. And as a consequence, they now have enough food to feed the people they have. The only real exception to this trend is the United States, which has been able to keep up with its population in terms of the amount of food it produces and have enough left over to literally feed the rest of the world. America, therefore, really is the Saudi Arabia of food for the rest of the world and as it's often referred to, the breadbasket of the world. So why isn't the food getting to the people who need it? Well, part of it is the fact that the food that is most readily accessible to those people is being grown in their own countries, and those countries are suffering from droughts and other climatic um, issues that prevent them from growing sufficient foods for their people. But far too often, the problem has nothing to do with weather or the ability to grow food. For instance, there are many countries that are governed by dictatorial regimes, such as in North Korea and Zimbabwe and some other developing countries, whose political leaders will not allow food aid to come into their countries to feed their people, because by allowing this food aid to come into their countries, they are admitting that they cannot provide for their own people. And they do not wish to lose face with the rest of the world by admitting that they can't support their own populations. So they would rather let their population starve than to lose face politically. In other cases, even with the best of intentions, um, your desires can backfire on you. For instance, the United States and European countries have often donated large amounts of food aid to countries that were undergoing challenges with a famine. But in so doing, they were providing to those countries' populations free food, and in so doing, undermining the farmers of that country that were able to produce some food, but were now unable to economically compete with free food. And so those farmers, unable to sell their crops, at least at a wage that were, or at a price that would allow them to stay profitable, ended up losing their farms and becoming poor and in need of food aid themselves. So the issue is not a simple one, and involves a number of different factors. And as we saw earlier in the course, a sustainable solution requires more than simply good science. It requires both economic incentives as well as social and political will and ability to address the problem in a sustainable way that will work for now and for future human populations.